Hello, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about a little bit more about species. So we talked about species once before, but we're going to revisit that because there are a few definitions. So what is a species? The biological species concept defines species as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This is the most useful definition for studying evolution because it can explain evolutionary patterns. But why isn't it the definition? Because it doesn't apply to asexual organisms. And it can't apply to fossils or extinct species because we can't study their ability to mate, And sometimes we do find individuals that are considered two separate species, but they still have the ability to mate. For example, the grizzly bear and the polar bear, making the growler bear. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The morphological species concept states that a species is comprised of organisms that have the same body shape or body structure. Remember, morphology means relating to shape and structure. This can be applied to asexual and sexual organisms, but it's problematic because distinguishing species would be subjective. What I say looks similar may not be what another scientist says is similar. Under the morphological species concept, we would probably consider the following two birds pictured here the same species. I mean, they are almost identical in shape and structure and color, but they are actually considered two different species. Pictured here are the eastern and western meadowlark type of bird. They often don't occupy the same territory, but if they even border the same territory, they don't usually even want to mate because they sing different songs that the other bird does not find appealing to mate with. The next species definition is the ecological species concept. The ecological species concept states that a species is comprised of a group of organisms that share the same ecological niche. And a niche is a set of conditions or resources that an organism needs to survive. So for an oak tree, part of its niche would include the water requirements, its light requirements, and its ability to handle drought conditions. So the ecological species concept accommodates sexual and asexual organisms, and it even emphasizes the role that natural selection might play in these species, but it doesn't include the aspect of reproduction. Lastly, the only other species definition that you should be aware of, because there are about 20 total, is the phylogenetic species concept. This states that a species is the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor, a common ancestral species. This also can be applied to sexual and asexual organisms. This definition is useful at times in determining how species are related. It's based on evolutionary history. It uses similarities in body features and DNA sequences to figure out how species are related. This definition can also be a bit subjective because we as scientists have to decide how similar the DNA sequences have to be in order to be considered the same species. So altogether, the biological species concept, the morphological species concept, and the phylogenetic species concept together are used by scientists to classify organisms. So how does a new species arise? Well, speciation is the process by which one species splits into two or more. It's the creation of a new species. It's thought about as a branching process. So you will soon see examples of these branching trees that show speciation events, how species diverge into multiple species. And so in the very rough branching tree that I drew at the top of the screen, the branching points represent speciation events, where one species splits into two, and then maybe later on that same species splits into another two. So speciation is thought about as a branching process. Speciation begins with reproductive isolation, which are biological barriers that prevent members of two groups from mating and producing viable and fertile offspring. There are two categories of reproductive isolation: prezygotic and postzygotic. I want you to say those words out loud: prezygotic and postzygotic. Does any part of it stand out to you? It has the word zygote in there. Remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. Prezygotic barriers are barriers that exist before a zygote is even formed. Pre-zygote. They prevent fertilization from even happening. Post-zygotic barriers are barriers that happen after a zygote is formed. After the zygote is formed is literally what it means. So yes, two organisms from two different species can mate and produce offspring, But there are some barriers that arise post-fertilization that prevent them from being considered the same species. So let's start with the prezygotic barriers. There are 5 prezygotic barriers. Habitat isolation is the first one. This occurs when 2 species occupy different habitats, preventing them from even encountering each other while mating. For example, these 2 fly species in the genus Rhagoletis occur in the same geographic areas, but the apple maggot fly feeds and mates on apples, while its close relative, the blueberry maggot fly, mates and lays its eggs only on blueberries. So while they're occupying the same location and they may even fly and bump into each other sometimes, they don't mate in the same habitat, so it's very unlikely that they'd even mate. Now, temporal isolation, the next barrier, happens when species breed during different times of the day, different seasons, or different years, and because of that, they never mate. So pictured here is the western spotted skunk and the eastern spotted skunk. They are found in overlapping areas, but the western skunk mates in the late summer, and the eastern skunk mates in the late winter, so that prevents them from interbreeding. Next is behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation occurs when courtship rituals or other behaviors that attract mates are unique to a species, and they aren't as effective at attracting even closely related species. For example, the blue-footed booby. Blue-footed boobies mate only after a courtship display unique to their species. The male does this cool high-step behavior that calls the female's attention to his bright blue feet. I'll try to include a video of that below. Mechanical isolation occurs when mating can be attempted at the same place and time, but the actual sexual organs are incompatible, like being different sizes and shapes. So one example includes the snails that are pictured here. These are 2 different species of snails, and the snails' shells, they spiral in different directions. One spirals clockwise and the other spirals counterclockwise. And so the snail's genital openings are not aligned, so they physically cannot mate. Now, before I explain gametic isolation, I want you to listen to the word gametic. Do you hear the root word? Gamete? Like eggs and sperm? This is when the sperm of one species can't fertilize the eggs of another species. Even if they're mating at the same time and the sex organs are compatible, the sperm may not be able to survive in the reproductive tract of the female. For example, sea urchins release their sperm and eggs into the surrounding water, where they fuse and form zygotes. The gametes of different sea urchins often don't fuse because there are proteins on the surface of the egg and sperm that bind very poorly to the egg and sperm of other sea urchin species. Now, sometimes mating does occur. Egg and sperm fuse, but there are postzygotic barriers that prevent consistent reproduction. So we're looking at the left-hand side of this image now. Reduced hybrid viability is one barrier. This means that the genes of the different parent species may interact in ways that impair the hybrid's development. So it could fail to survive as an embryo, or it affects its survival in the environment as an adult. So there are salamanders of different species that live in the same area and they can mate, but the hybrids they produce are fragile and they don't survive too long. Reduced hybrid fertility refers to hybrids that can survive the same average lifespan and they aren't weak, but they are sterile. If the parent species have different chromosome numbers, then the offspring may not be able to produce viable egg or sperm. One example of that includes the horse and the donkey and their ability to mate and create a mule, or the female version of a mule, a hinny. And lastly, some first-generation hybrids are viable and fertile, but when they mate with another hybrid or even the parent species, the next generation is either feeble or sterile. So you can think that the viability and fertility of hybrids is breaking down over generations. That's hybrid breakdown. So again, these are all the barriers that can lead to the split of one species into 2. So there are 2 major types of speciation. One is allopatric speciation. Allopatric means other country. This is when a new species forms due to one group in the population becoming geographically, physically separated. That separated group is experiencing some other location, some other environment, where natural selection might be selecting for different traits. The geographic barrier could be a mountain, an earthquake that separates 2 land masses, or an island that breaks off of a mainland. The formation of these structures is sometimes called a vicariance event, so you might read about that. Now, in the picture to the right, let's say that this orange fish population lives in a lake that has some natural, interesting land structures protruding from the floor. But because the fish can swim to either location, they continue to swim around, they continue to mate, and the genes in this population continue to flow. A factor that could cause allopatric speciation would be if the water started to recede. As the water recedes, that land protrusion now serves as a geographic barrier between these two now different pools of water, and fish can't cross that barrier. So the population is now split into two subpopulations. The genes cannot flow between these two populations. Remember gene flow? Gene flow was the movement of alleles into or out of the population. So over time, the gene pools in the subpopulations will diverge as differences in mutations arise in each subpopulation, and natural selection and genetic drift alter the allele frequencies in different ways in the separated populations. If there was a mutation that arose in one population, like the allele for having blue scales, blue fish, and it was passed down and selected for, that could become prevalent in one population, and it wouldn't spread in the other population because they're not interbreeding. Here's another example of allopatric speciation in an experiment that was performed. So a population of mosquito fish were separated into two different ponds, and water was allowed to recede to separate the ponds. There were more predators in one pond than the other. And if there are lots of predators, natural selection typically selects for fish that can escape quickly, so fish that can swim faster in short bursts, which is associated with a particular body shape. But with very few predators, natural selection often selects for fish that can swim for longer periods of time, and that is associated with a slimmer body shape. Interestingly enough, when they brought the populations of mosquito fish back together, they noticed that the females preferred to mate with the males that swam like them and had the same body shape as them. This is a form of reproductive isolation. Females with the thicker body shape are no longer mating with the males of the sleek body shape if they don't have to. Take a minute and write down which reproductive barrier this is if females are choosing to mate with fish that swim like them. Okay, assuming you wrote it down, this is an example of a prezygotic barrier because it is happening before a zygote can even be formed. And specifically, it's a behavioral isolation. So these two populations of fish are on their way to become different species. Give it a few thousand years and the two subpopulations will no longer be able to mate with one another. Then we'll consider them two different species. Remember that the physical separation of these two subpopulations is not a biological barrier, it's a geographical barrier. The reproductive barrier that we observed was intrinsic to the organism itself. It wasn't caused by the geographic barrier. That was already existed within that population. The other type of speciation is sympatric speciation, which actually means same country. So there is no geographic barrier here separating individuals in the population. Sympatric speciation occurs when one group of the population becomes reproductively isolated from the rest within one geographic area. Sympatric speciation is less common than allopatric speciation because members of the population can still maintain contact with one another. So you would wonder, well, why aren't they mating? Well, this can occur if gene flow within the population is interrupted by something like polyploidy. It can be interrupted by sexual selection, where some females are only choosing to mate with males with certain features or behaviors, or even habitat differentiation, which brings us back to that example of the two types of flies, the apple maggot flies and the blueberry maggot flies, which occupy the same area but mate on different fruits. So let's talk about these three a little more in depth. An example of habitat differentiation includes these palm trees. These palm trees are found on a small island that was formed by the highly eroded remains of a volcano. The two species of palm trees that are found today are sister species. They split from a common ancestor, and they are found within feet of each other. There's no geographic barrier separating them. On the island, there are two major soil types, volcanic soil and calcareous soil, which is coral-based sand-like soil. Volcanic soil existed first, and calcareous soil was just blown in over time later. And so some palms ended up growing in calcareous soil, while others grew in the volcanic soils. And the palm species can survive in both. Nutrients in these types of soil differ, so over time, the plants that grew in the volcanic soils ended up flowering earlier in the year than the plants that grew in calcareous soils. Flowers are the reproductive structures for plants. So since plants growing in volcanic soils produce flowers earlier in the season, they were only able to mate with each other. And plants that grow on the calcareous soils are only able to mate with each other later in the season. So this should remind you of a reproductive barrier that we talked about earlier. Take a minute and write down what you think that is. So hopefully you wrote down a pre-zygotic barrier because this is happening before a zygote can even be formed. And more specifically, it's a temporal isolation because they're mating at different times of the year. So even though the plants are geographically in the same area, they are now reproductively isolated. In this case, the palms have fully diverged into two different species. Cichlids provide an example of sexual selection. So cichlids are a type of fish that exist as 600 different species. Many of these species are due to how females choose mates based on color. For example, in an experiment, researchers had put two sympatric species of cichlid together in aquarium tanks. One aquarium tank had normal light, and the other aquarium tank had orange light. And under the normal light, the two species are noticeably different, and the females had a clear mate preference for males that were members of their own species. But under the orange light, the two species looked fairly similar. And so females ended up not being as choosy, and they mated with males of either species with equal frequency. The hybrids produced were both viable and fertile. But under normal conditions, the barrier that keeps these gene pools separate is mate choice by females. And because they can produce viable hybrid fish, this suggests that the speciation between these two groups happened very recently. And now polyploidy. Polyploidy is the presence of extra sets of chromosomes in cells. It usually occurs as an accident in cell division, and it's most common in plants. Polyploidy tends to be lethal in animals. Two diploid parents can produce polyploid offspring, and in plants, tetraploid offspring can reproduce with themselves, but can't mate with diploid species because the offspring would be triploid, and triploid individuals have reduced fertility. So polyploid offspring have a different number of chromosomes from their parents, and they're reproductively isolated from their parents because they can't breed with the parent. Now let's take a deeper dive. Autopolyploids form when parents of the same species mate to produce offspring that have more chromosomes than the parents. Autopolyploids are formed when there's an error in cell division of the parent species. So auto means self because it's two of the same species. If you're a parent and you're diploid, and prior to cell division, the chromosomes duplicate and the cells fail to divide, then that error creates a tetraploid cell. Okay, you went from diploid, having two sets of chromosomes, to being tetraploid, having four sets of chromosomes. If that tetraploid cell undergoes meiosis, what would be the ploidy of the new cells formed? The answer is given here. They would be diploid because meiosis cuts the chromosome number in half. It's a little bit of a review from Bio 115. If a diploid gamete is fertilized by another diploid gamete, which is possible because plants can self-fertilize, hence why the offspring is called an autopolyploid, and the offspring will be tetraploid. An autopolyploid can mate with itself or other autopolyploids, but it can't mate with the parental generation because the resulting zygote will have an odd number of chromosomes, which throws off the homologous pairing and meiosis, and the seeds in the pollen don't develop normally. Allopolyploids is a different kind of polyploid. They form when parents from different species mate to produce offspring that have more chromosomes than the parent. So remember that the root word allo means other. So this is when one species mates with an other species. And the offspring, the hybrid, might be infertile and unable to reproduce. So in this example, a diploid species parent A has a total chromosome number of 6. And the other parent species B, is diploid and has a chromosome number of 4. When the species A, parent species, undergoes meiosis, the gamete will be haploid with a total chromosome number of 3. Species B, when it undergoes meiosis to produce a gamete, the gamete will be haploid with a chromosome number of 2. When these two gametes fuse, the zygote will have 5 chromosomes total. The hybrid with 5 chromosomes would be sterile because there's no way to equally divide 5 chromosomes into 4 cells during meiosis. Odd numbers of chromosomes means the organism is likely sterile. However, don't lose hope. If one of the hybrids later develops some cell division error that affects its chromosome number, in this example, the chromosome number changes to 10, maybe because the chromosomes duplicated and never separated during a non-disjunction event in mitosis. This even number of chromosomes could then potentially start to produce offspring. Allopolyploids can still have the same ploidy as the parent, but they still don't have the same number of chromosomes as the parents. So for example, after this mutation, this hybrid offspring is now diploid with a total chromosome count of 10. So it has the same ploidy as the parents because both parents were both diploid. They had two sets of chromosomes, but the total chromosome number is different. You may be asked to consider if two different organisms will be able to produce fertile offspring based on their ploidy. So imagine a diploid individual mating with a tetraploid individual. It doesn't even matter the total number of chromosomes they have. When they mate gametes, the diploid will make haploid gametes, and the tetraploid will make diploid gametes. When a haploid and diploid gamete fuse, it makes a triploid zygote, which will have an odd number of chromosomes, which will produce sterile gametes. So we've talked about the potential of different species mating to make hybrids, but this isn't just happening flagrantly everywhere. Hybrid zones are geographic regions where members of different species mate. It can be used to study the mechanisms that lead to reproductive isolation. Some hybrid zones occur as really narrow bands, like this example with the yellow-bellied toad and the fire-bellied toad. Their hybrid zone extends about 4,000 kilometers, but it's less than 10 kilometers across. So just to orient you on this map, the yellow zone is where the yellow-bellied toad lives, and the orange zone is where the fire-bellied toad lives. And that really dark, harsh red line in between them is the hybrid zone. This is where you can find a lot of hybrids between these two different species. Most times, hybrid zones don't form a distinct band like this, but rather a series of isolated patches along the zone. Hybrids often have reduced fitness compared to the parent species populations, meaning that they're a little bit less able to survive and reproduce. Hybrid zones provide really great natural experiments in speciation. They ask the question, will hybrids become completely reproductively isolated from the parent species to become a new species? If not, then there are three other outcomes for the hybrid zone. One is reinforcement. Reinforcement is when reproductive barriers become more prominent. When reinforcement occurs, reproductive barriers are stronger for sympatric species than for allopatric species. That means that reproductive barriers become stronger for similar species living in the same location rather than in different locations. One example is with the flycatchers. The flycatchers are types of birds, and the males are more similar in allopatric populations than in sympatric populations. So in the hybrid zone, males of different species look more different from one another. And the females are choosy, so they only choose the male of their own species to mate with. Outside of the hybrid zone, males of different species may look relatively similar, and the females don't have a strong mate preference. So in this way, reinforcement is a type of natural selection. Now, fusion is when reproductive barriers are weakened, and the populations will fuse into a single species. If the hybrids are fit as parents, there can be lots of gene flow between the two parent species. If the gene flow is great enough, reproductive barriers weaken, and the parent species fuse into a single species. For example, the cichlids again, the fish with the 600 species and the very selected females. Pollution in the lake that cichlids live in has reduced the ability of female cichlids to distinguish males of a different species. So females end up mating with different males from different species and produce lots of hybrids, thereby weakening that reproductive barrier that was formed by sexual selection. And lastly, stability. Stability occurs when you have lots of gene flow from outside of the hybrid zone. This overwhelms the selection for increased reproductive isolation happening inside the hybrid zone. So, how long does speciation take? Well, we can use the fossil record, molecular data, and morphological data to estimate the time between speciation events. The fossil record shows that some new species appeared suddenly and then persisted and remained extant for some years, given their presence in the geologic strata, those layers in the sedimentary rock, and then suddenly their presence disappears, where they likely went extinct. So punctuated equilibrium is a model of speciation that describes this pattern, where new species suddenly branch from a parent species. Then they change very little for the rest of their existence. And when we say rapid with punctuated equilibrium, we mean rapid based on the length of time that the organism was on Earth. For example, if an organism survives on Earth for 5 million years, but most of the speciation events occurred in the first 50,000 years of its existence, then that's an indication of punctuated equilibrium. 50,000 years doesn't sound like a rapid time to us, but it is quick compared to a 5 million year existence of a species. Other species appear to change more gradually over long periods of time. So the model of gradual change predicts that there is a gradual change in species. So if that's the case, then we should find gradual change in the fossils as we move up through the strata, through the different layers. And both of these hypotheses have been supported by the fossil record. And remember, the fossil record also isn't perfect, it's not complete. So both of these models are accepted because studies have found that even with the cichlids, the interval between speciation events is as short as 4,000 years. But then for some beetles, the interval between speciation events could take 40 million years. The average for organisms is about 6.5 million years. Honestly, it just depends. It raises some cool questions, though, that scientists can ask regarding speciation, like there are genetic changes that occur as new species form. Scientists have to determine how many genes have to be different for organisms to be considered a new species. This can range from 1 to thousands of differences in their genes. We'll talk more about how scientists decide the relation between species in the next lecture.